Hello, everyone. I'm Keith DeStone, and welcome to the Cosmos Society Online Open House Series, which is a production of the Harvard University Center for Hellenic Studies. Our guest today is Zoe Kalamara. She is pursuing her doctoral studies at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and is also a recent CHS Aristotle University Fellow in Hellenic Studies. She works on the fragmentarily preserved tragedies that deal with the aftermath of the Trojan War. The title of her dissertation is The Myth of Niobe in the Tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles. But today she's here to talk with us about the Aeschylean Odyssey, a journey in fragments. So Zoe, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for putting up with all the technical difficulties that we had at the beginning of this meeting.
Thank you for the invitation.
As I previewed for you earlier, I wanted to start by asking you what first sparked your interest in the ancient world and pursuing it in this academic manner.
Yeah, okay, it's actually a nice story because my grandmother was a classicist and my grandfather was a theologist. So I grew up in a house full of books, and I read a lot as a child and I quite enjoyed it. And then in high school, I had some great teachers, ancient Greek literature and language teachers. And to be honest, there was never really a doubt in my mind that I would eventually follow that path. And I'm quite happy I did.
It's wonderful. That is a nice story. Thank you for sharing it. Okay, so now I'll turn it over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, as you said, for my dissertation, I studied the aftermath of the Trojan War in Aeschylus and Sophocles' Fragments. So I explored the adventures concerning the nostos of various heroes. And quite obviously, the most famous nostos is that of Odysseus. And as you would expect, Aeschylus could not resist the temptation. So he composed 4 plays concerning the hero's return home. Now, we assume that these 4 plays form a dramatic tetralogy consisting of 3 tragedies and 1 satiric drama. But unfortunately, this tetralogy is highly fragmentary and controversial, and there is an ongoing debate over the nature and the order of the plays. Which has resulted in numerous combinations within the tetralogy. Now, however, most scholars accept the hypothesis that was proposed by Vilamovich in 1884, according to which the tetralogy consists of the tragedies Psychagogii, Penelope, and Ostologi, in that order, and the satyr play Circe. Now, what I'm going to try and do now is present to you a reconstruction of this dramatic tetralogy, and then show you how Aeschylus chooses to deal with this rich epic tradition that regards Odysseus, and how he chooses to deal with this vastly popular myth that he inherits. So first of all, a few words about each play. The first play of the tragic trilogy is the Psychagogii. In English, it's either the Soul Raisers or the Ghost Raisers. And it deals with Odysseus' trip to the underworld, which means that it corresponds to book 11 of the Odyssey. Now, the surviving fragments suggest that some professional necromancers aid Odysseus in his attempt to contact Tiresias, and the setting of the play must have been a lake from which one could enter the underworld, and it's a lake either next to the Acheron or the Avernus Nekyomanteion. Now, at the beginning of the play, Odysseus finds the oracle and meets its inhabitants, who are, of course, the members of the chorus, and introduce themselves and say that they are necromancers, worshippers of Hermes. Now, the necromancers proceed to advise Odysseus on the ritual that he has to follow in order to summon the spirits of the dead, and upon doing so, at some point, he brings up the spirit of Tiresias, the seer who foretells the king's bizarre death. We do not know how the play concludes, but it is probable that Odysseus announces his departure to Ithaca, where the second part of the tragic trilogy unravels. And that second part, as I said, is Penelope, of which we know very little. We know that it corresponds to books 20 to 23 of the Odyssey. It takes place in Ithaca, somewhere inside the palace, and deals with two major events, which are the killing of the suitors by Odysseus and the reunion between Penelope and Odysseus. So we're left with the conclusion of the trilogy, which is the most controversial one, because many scholars consider it to be a satyr drama and not a tragedy. It's the Ostologi, which in English is the bone gatherers, those who gather the bones of the deceased. And the Ostologi recalls the last book of the Odyssey and the beginning of the Telegony, where the relatives of the murdered suitors arrive at the palace to gather the remains of their loved ones and offer them a proper burial. Now, in the Aeschylean account of the myth, Odysseus stays at the palace and he does not flee to the countryside as he does in the Odyssey. He confronts the relatives who form the chorus of the play at the palace, and they are all surrounded by the dead bodies of the suitors or by the urns that contain their bones. And then Odysseus gives a negative funeral speech for the most prominent suitors and recounts the humiliations that he suffered by them when he was still disguised as a beggar and hadn't revealed his true identity. Now, those humiliations are far worse than the ones described in the Odyssey. So he tries to justify the killing, and we assume that he somehow manages to persuade the relatives that he was right to do what he did. And perhaps a god or a goddess intervenes, and it is safe to hypothesize that at the end of the play, with or without divine intervention, the chorus and Odysseus make peace. Finally, we have Circe, which is unquestionably of satiric nature and completes the dramatic tetralogy. Circe corresponds to Book 10 of the Odyssey. It is related to that episode and narrates the metamorphosis that the Odyssean crew suffers at the hands of Circe. And it is very tempting to assume, but we don't have enough evidence, but it is tempting to assume that the satyrs are the shepherds of Circe's pigs, among which we find the poor sailors from Ithaca who wait for their king to come and liberate them. This grouping is reasonable because it is in line with the usual practice of Aeschylus to present three tragedies that deal with episodes of the same myth, and then a satyr drama which is inspired by an episode of the trilogy. And we see that Aeschylus chooses to portray the most memorable episodes of the hero's adventures, which are, of course, the trip to the underworld and the killing of the insolent suitors. It is true, and it is also unfortunate, that we have very little information regarding this tetralogy. It is nonetheless apparent that Aeschylus draws upon popular Homeric and perhaps also cyclic episodes in order to compete with this epic world that he inherits. He engages in a dialogue with his archetypes and then proceeds to revise them. But the fragmentary nature of the trilogy does not grant us the evidence that we need in order to understand the full extent of this attempted revision. I will now try to explain how Aeschylus deconstructs the epic hero and the world from which he comes in order to present a radically different Odysseus from the one that we find in the epic. He has to reshape both the characters and the setting of its myth in order to detach them from the glory of the epic world. So he employs various techniques. He reframes epic episodes against a different background. He marginalizes the epic protagonist, which is, of course, Odysseus. He inverts the epic prophecy concerning the hero's death. He makes ironic allusions to the epic text, and he portrays several positive epic episodes in a negative light. I will show you examples of its technique. So let me start screen sharing. Okay. So you know that in the Odyssey, Circe gives Odysseus advice, and but she's not physically present when the hero travels to the underworld. So Odysseus is alone in a journey to a fearsome unknown place, which is literally positioned at the edge of the world, at the end of the ocean. And upon following Circe's advice, Odysseus is left all alone to interact with the souls of the dead, and he's in a state of constant fear. Now, this dangerous trip is transformed in the Psychagogy, since Aeschylus reframes it against a different, far less dangerous background. The Aeschylean Nekia takes place in a geographically identifiable place, which is a lake either next to the Acheron or the Avernus Oracle of the Dead, as I already mentioned. Now, by transferring the Nekia from this undetermined geographical setting to a real-life location, Aeschylus removes the exotic elements and lessens the fear of the unknown that Odysseus has to deal with. Now, moreover, in this version of the myth, Odysseus is not alone in his quest. He is aided by the members of the chorus, who, as you can see in fragment 273, are professional necromancers that give him advice so that he can safely and successfully summon Tiresias. Now, the fact that the chorus is physically present during this adventure obviously diminishes the danger that Odysseus is faced with. And finally, it is important that the chorus says that the souls of the dead will travel upwards in order to meet with Odysseus. If you look at fragment 273a, the swarm of the souls, the esmos, will move upwards. And then the chorus mentions that the water too, the infernal water, moves upwards. So we have a repetition of the verb aneimi, which means to move upwards or to be sent upwards. So that means that all activities take place on the surface, which is the world of the living. So there is no blurring between the two worlds, as is the case in the epic. So to sum up, we see that Aeschylus in the Soul Raiders places the entrance to the underworld in a real and not a magical place, portrays an Odysseus that is not alone but accompanied by attendants of the oracle, and includes no implication of a catabasis in his play. Now, obviously, this change of setting and the subsequent shift in focus result in the marginalization of Odysseus. Aeschylus downplays the hero's contribution during both the journey to the underworld and the killing of the suitors. Now, let's start with the journey to the underworld. The poet's choice to surround Odysseus with necromancers deprives him of his traditional role of the leader. And it's not like he didn't have any other choice. I mean, he could have easily chosen a chorus of sailors, or even better, a chorus of the nameless souls of the dead. And then Odysseus would have retained his leading part in the expedition, and he would have been obligated to use his boldness and his intelligence, whereas now all he does is follow orders and participate in what is more or less a walkthrough. So this choice of chorus changes the uncharted mission to a prescribed ritual and leaves little room for bravery and initiative on behalf of Odysseus. Now, the same technique, the marginalization of the epic protagonist, can be found in Penelope too. Again, Aeschylus could have chosen a different title. He could have chosen the title Odysseus or Mnistiron Aneresis, the killing of the suitors, which is what the play is about after all. But naming the play after Penelope and not after its alleged major episode, which is the killing of the suitors, might be a conscious attempt by the poet to shift the attention away from Odysseus and focus on his wife instead. Now, we know that the action takes place inside the palace, and we assume that it takes place in the queen's chamber, away from the hall of the palace where the killing of the suitors takes place. Now, as the title of the play suggests, Penelope herself, and subsequently her room, inevitably become the focal point of the tragedy. And we assume that there are some secondary characters of the tragedy, like the nurse Euryclea, or perhaps other nameless maidservants, who are employed to narrate Odysseus' actions that happen off-screen. So by doing that, Aeschylus deprives Odysseus of his great moment of glory by making his triumph the background of the play. Now, if anyone has any questions or any comments, you can interrupt me at any time. That's okay. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next technique, which is the inversion of the prophecy. The inversion of the prophecy that concerns the hero's death plays a crucial part in the deconstruction of the Homeric world. Now, you all know that in the Odyssey, Tiresias predicts Odysseus' death. And what he predicts is a very peaceful and gentle death for the hero that will come at an old age, as you can see the first text on the slide. So Tiresias says that death will come to you exalos, far from the sea or from the sea, a death very gentle, and that death will lay you low when you're overcome with sleek old age, and your people will dwell in prosperity around you. So Odysseus will see his people prosper and eventually die in a way that could be considered ideal. Now, the phrase exalos is perhaps intentionally ambiguous and has become the subject of scholarly dispute, but it is reasonable to assume that Tiresias predicts a death that will come to Odysseus in dry land after having escaped from the sea, which is the domain where Poseidon exhibits his wrath. Now, the death is described as avlichros mala, as very gentle. And there is another adjective that is used to describe the hero's old age, which is the adjective liparos. Liparos literally means shiny, but in this context, it means healthy looking. And then Tiresias reassures Odysseus that his people will be olvi, they will be happy and blessed with riches, and that completes the picture of a perfect death. Odysseus will die after having accomplished all his duties, both as a war hero and as a king. It should nonetheless be noted that Tiresias uses the verb pefni, from the verb thino, a verb that is used in the epic to describe a violent and quick death, a death that usually occurs on the battlefield. Now, there is another account of Odysseus' death, the one told by the poet of the Telegon. And here the hero is killed by Telegonos, the son Odysseus had with Circe. Now, this account offers a different interpretation of exalos. Telegonus travels by ship to Ithaca and then wounds his father with an arrow whose edge is made by the spine of a stingray, which is, of course, a sea creature. So here we have a drastically different ending for Odysseus, one where the death comes from the sea and not away from it, with the post-Homeric invention of Telegonus taking the leading part. Now, evidently, this death cannot be considered either gentle or ideal, because Odysseus is violently killed by his own son, but it is nonetheless a somewhat heroic death because Telegonus engages in a battle with his father, making Odysseus die a death that resembles those reserved for the warriors in the Iliad. Now, let's see how Aeschylus deals with all that. In the Psychagogy, in fragment 275, we find the Aeschylean prophecy concerning Odysseus' death. So Tiresias speaks to Odysseus and says that the heron in flight will strike you from above with its dung when it opens its bowels, and from this, the barb of a sea creature will rot your aged, hairless skin. There is no doubt that Aeschylus consciously and ironically inverts the epic prophecy. A heron will strike and infect Odysseus' skin with his excrement. The word for excrement in Greek is onthos, that will contain a lethal spine of fish. Now, such an ignominious death is certainly in contrast both to the gentle death Tiresias predicts in the Odyssey and the somehow heroic death that Odysseus suffers in the Telegon. Now, Aeschylus describes the king's agonizing decay and awards him an unheroic and undignified death. He focuses on the negative aspects of old age and puts emphasis on the king's demise rather than prosperous longevity. Now, his skin is described, as you can see, as paleon and trichories. Paleon, well, is self-explanatory, whereas trichories, which is an apax legomenon, refers to the shedding of hair, which is a process universally associated with physical decline and loss of strength. Thus, the good-looking skin of the epic, if you remember the adjective liparos that we just saw, is here transformed into a rotting one. Also, Odysseus's death will come slowly and probably in an agonizing way, as the verb sipsi, sipo means to rot, suggests. Now, the contrast with the verb pephne that we read in Homer is striking. The epic prophecy describes a death that will at least be quick, whereas the tragic prophecy a slow and quite possibly torturous one. But what truly bothers us here is the cause of his death, which is absurd to the point of ridiculous, because Odysseus's death does not correspond at all to the values of the epic poetry. And in fact, his demise is so ludicrous that some scholars considered the Soul Raisers to be a satyr drama. Odysseus dies an old, ordinary man, not by the hand of a brave hero or by a god, but because of an infection that is caused by a trivial sea creature. Now, however troubling this choice might seem, it can be explained if we consider it part of the intertextual dialogue that Aeschylus consciously creates between his poetry and that of his epic predecessors. Aeschylus alludes to the epic text through ironic intertextual puns, and the most characteristic examples of this technique come from this fragment from the prophecy. So Tiresias speaks of a heron, an erodios, a bird that will eventually be the cause of Odysseus' death. The mention of a heron is a bizarre and puzzling one, and many scholars have lost sleep over it, but it can be understood as an ironic allusion to the Iliad. You will see exactly what I mean right now. So in the Iliad, in book 10, Odysseus and Diomedes get ready to go spy on the enemy, and they hear the cry of a heron that flies on the right side. Now it is too dark, so they can't actually see the bird, but they interpret its cry as a good omen. Now, in fact, the heron is sent by Athena to assure the two warriors of the success of their mission. And that's why we read that Odysseus was glad at the omen and made prayer to Athena. He is glad because the bird is a sign of his upcoming victory, and he knows that. But in Aeschylus, the same bird, the heron, signifies the hero's death. Now, they are both sent by the gods, but the epic heron foreshadows the favorable outcome of his mission, whereas the tragic one, consciously chosen by Aeschylus, marks Odysseus' demise. And there is another example, which we can find later in the Iliad, during the funeral games in honor of Patroclus, where Ajax and Odysseus engage in a speed race to win a silver ball. And the race is very close, but Ajax is ahead, he's going to win, and then Odysseus prays to Athena to help him win instead. So Athena intervenes and makes Ajax sleep on the filth of the sacrificed bulls, and the word for this filth is onthos. As a result, Odysseus outruns Ajax and wins the race. So Odysseus takes here a victory that he should not have won by having a god cheat on his behalf. In Aeschylus, a different onthos causes Odysseus the greatest defeat of his life, which is a painful and disgraceful death. So we see that Aeschylus uses the elements of Odysseus' epic triumphs against him. The heron that was once a herald of victory now becomes the carrier of the poison that will kill him, whereas the filth that once ensured his athletic victory now contains the spike that will lead to his final defeat. So we already examined the methods that Aeschylus uses to sideline and eventually undermine the epic Odysseus in the Soul Raisers and Penelope. Now, similar is the case with the last part of the trilogy, the Bone Gatherers, the Ostologi, where here Aeschylus portrays positive epic episodes in a negative light. And you all know that in the Odyssey, Odysseus' return to Ithaca is not followed by immediate glory and joy and victory. the king is disguised as a beggar and he is mocked by the suitors several times. He is often attacked by them. But in general, epic Odysseus gets to defend himself from the suitors and from that beggar, if you recall, Eros, the insolent beggar that insults him. In the Ostology, however, it seems that Odysseus fails to react to these humiliations until he reveals who he is and kills the insolent suitors. We have two surviving fragments from the Ostology, and the affronts contained in them are so extreme that they encourage some scholars to assume that the Ostology is in fact the satyr play of the tetralogy. Now, you can see this is from Book 18 of the Odyssey, where Eurymachus, one of the most prominent suitors, is angry at the beggar, so he seizes a footstool, a sphelas, and attempts to hurt Odysseus, who, however, manages to avoid being struck. The poor cupbearer is struck instead. Now, let's see how he changes that episode, how that episode changes in the Ostology. In fragment 179, Odysseus is the speaker, and he says that Eurymachus made my head his mark. He made my head his target and kept aiming true during the game of Kotavos, which is a drinking game they used to play in antiquity, and as you can see the image left on your left. So a positive epic episode is here transformed into a negative one. Eurymachus uses Odysseus' head as a target during a drinking game, and he is told to have repeatedly succeeded in offending him without missing once. So we see that what Eurymachus fails to do in epic, he manages to do several times in tragedy. Notice the word ai on this fragment. And notice how the target is the king's head. That will come in handy later. Now, later in the Odyssey, we have another dinner scene in Book 20, where there is a different suitor, Ctesippus, who also tries to ridicule Odysseus and throws a cow's hoof at him. But he misses, as you can see on the text. Odysseus avoids it with a quick turn of his head. And after he avoids it, he smiles a right grim and bitter smile. Now let's see what happens in the Ostology. Second fragment of the Ostology, Odysseus is the speaker again and says, "This is the man who once threw in my direction an object designed to make me a laughing stock, velos gelatopion, the evil-smelling chamber pot, and he did not miss his aim. Έριψεν ουδήπαρτε. It struck me on the head and smashed into fragments, wafting over me an odor very unlike that of perfume jars." So, unlike their epic ancestors, the suitors who attack Odysseus do not miss. Aeschylus seems to recall here the epic text in order to correct it by having the suitors aim right this time. And we saw that in the Odyssey, Odysseus is the one who smiles after Ctesippus attempts to ridicule him. And he is safe from the embarrassment, he is certain of his upcoming revenge. But in the Aeschylean drama, it is the suitors who laugh at him, velos gelatopion, after the chamber pot is broken over his head. And the unheroic use here of epic vocabulary, the words velos and the word tefieon, and the assault against the king's head, which is the part of the body that is made to wear the crown, the symbol of his power, all contribute to the deconstruction of Odysseus's epic prestige. Now, apparently, the description of a king whose head becomes the target during a drinking game, as well as that of one who lets an intruder break a chamber pot over his head, is highly uncharacteristic of the Odysseus that we know from the epic poetry. And however necessary it may be for Odysseus to not reveal his identity before his plan for killing the suitors is set in motion, the extent of ridicule that he has to suffer is excessive. Aeschylus consciously portrays a positive epic episode, which is Odysseus' return to Ithaca, in a negative light. He has the suitors succeed in their failed epic attempts to humiliate Odysseus and humbles the king by making him the laughingstock of the suitors. And the fact that he has to recount how he became the laughingstock of the suitors, that forces him to relive the humiliation for a second time. And we could go a bit further and say that even at the end of the trilogy, the killing of the abusive suitors and the subsequent restoration of peace in Ithaca probably bring little joy to Odysseus, because there is this prophecy of his disgraceful death that hangs over his head, and that makes his reinstatement to his pre-war status a less triumphant one than the one in the epic. So to sum up, in his alleged trilogy concerning the Odyssean Nostos, Aeschylus deconstructs the epic hero and the world from which he comes. He deprives Odysseus of his best epic qualities, these heroic traits that made him so special in the epic saga. His bravery, his cunningness, his endurance, they are all downgraded and challenged in this tragic trilogy. Aeschylus reshapes both the characters and the setting of the saga in order to detach them from the glory of the epic world. In The Soul Raisers, Aeschylus reframes the trip to the underworld against a less dangerous background and puts Odysseus in the sidelines by having a chorus of professional necromancers assist him during his perilous quest. He then inverts the epic prophecy concerning Odysseus' death by changing his demise into an unheroic and undignified one, unlike the two epic deaths that we know of. Lastly, Aeschylus makes ironic allusions to the epic text that both recall and at the same time convert the epic reality and negate the epic world. In Penelope, Aeschylus continues to marginalize Odysseus by having his loyal wife be the protagonist of the drama. He makes the killing of the suitors the background of the action instead of the central theme of the play. And finally, the last part of the trilogy, the Ostologi, involves the portrayal of positive epic episodes in a negative way, since Odysseus' arrival in Ithaca and the abusive behavior he is faced with is portrayed in an excessively unflattering way. Finally, the unheroic use of epic vocabulary throughout the tragic trilogy contributes to the further deconstruction of the heroic values and the traits of the epic Odysseus. Overall, Aeschylus presents an Odysseus that is not much more impressive than a regular man. He is outshone by other characters. His epic achievements are no longer presented as great feats. He is humiliated and brought to his knees by gods and humans. And we could say that he's finally defeated. Now, thank you very much for your attention. I'd be glad to listen to any comments or thoughts. So I'll turn back over to you, Keith, to moderate, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Thank you. That was really wonderful. It's good to experience a different side of Odysseus than we are used to if we focus on the Odyssey. It comes across quite differently in these fragments. Well, yeah, let's go to some questions. I see there are some. Let's see. Bill, I see you have your hand up, your Zoom hand. So go ahead.
Hey, that was a very good paper. I very much appreciated it on a subject I didn't know much about. So my questions are: how did this series of plays do? Did it win a prize or anything? I wondered about the reception it got at the time. Also, did he not like Odysseus, or is this typical of him to humiliate epic heroes?
Well, we know that it wasn't very popular as a tetralogy. We don't know if it won any prizes, but we compare it with the other tetralogy, with the trilogy with the Achilles, which is related to the Iliad, and the Iliadic trilogy was more popular, and we get that thanks to Aristophanes, who has many verses of the Achilles, but not that many of this trilogy. So we assume that it wasn't as popular. Now, there's a great question to why he does that, why Aeschylus portrays Odysseus that way. And we know that in general, Odysseus does not fare well in tragedy. So most tragedians do not like him. He's usually the bad guy. But I think that we could explain this portrayal as an attempt to restore ethical balance, because in the epic, Odysseus always wins and he's always God's favorite. And so maybe now he has to, let's say, redeem himself for what his epic predecessor did. But I don't know, this is just a hypothesis.
Makes sense though. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Gorgo, you're next in the line.
Yes, that was very, very interesting. So well presented, very clear. I just had two quick questions. One is, I also thought this seemed more like a satyr play than a tragedy, although of course we only have the fragment. So you mentioned something like this. Maybe you could comment again. And my second question is, given that this is an Athenian audience primarily, and that the goddess Athena was very predisposed to favor Odysseus, how does that how do you think the contemporary audience would interpret that in relationship specifically to Athena?
Okay, let me start with that second question. It is true that we do not have enough evidence to know exactly what happened. And if Athena is part of the trilogy, we assume that maybe she intervenes and helps him avoid the rage of the relatives during the Ostology. But sadly, we can't know. And the fact that the play was not very popular, the trilogy was not very popular, could actually be the answer to your question. Maybe they didn't like it because they didn't like the way he chose to portray Athena. I don't know. But you mentioned that you think that the Ostology could be a satyr drama, right? No. Okay. This is actually a reasonable hypothesis, but the problem is, what do we do with the chorus? Because an ostologos is a person who gathers the bones of a dead person. So if we say that it is a satyr drama, then we have to assume that the ostologi here are the beggars that go to the palace during the dinner scenes and try to gather bones to have something to eat. And it is not totally unlikely, but I like better the version that I presented, but I could be wrong, of course. And it's true that when we work with fragments, there is a great deal of uncertainty. So I can't be sure that what I presented here is correct. Thank you for your questions.
Jackie, go ahead.
Thank you. That was really interesting, and I enjoyed it. However, I'm not sure I agree totally with your data because I feel like the tragedies that you're talking about, and excuse me if I don't use the right terminology, are really enhancing, I think, the glory that is Odysseus. He is so elastic that you can take his story from any point of view, and he is still a heroic character. For instance, when he goes down to the underworld, he's going to the lowest point of the earth. When he goes with his oar, as Tiresias has instructed him, he's going to the highest, farthest part of the sea domain. He goes and travels until no one has a knowledge of his stories of Poseidon and his own glories. And when he's in the underworld, he meets Elpenor, who is the inverse, I think, of Odysseus. He's likable, but he's incompetent. He can't handle his drink. He falls off, and I think significantly, he breaks his neck, which means he's disconnecting his head, his crown. So I think he's the total inverse of Odysseus, but he does get that burial Odysseus promises. So I feel like the Odysseus story is just so, like I said, elastic, universal, that these tragedies can fit in, and they're still part of the entire story of Odysseus. I don't see a disconnect or an unraveling there.
Okay. I agree, of course. Aeschylus inherits a myth and a legend, Odysseus, and he has to do something with it. There would be no point in presenting the exact same version of the myth that we find in the Odyssey. So he changes that a bit. Doesn't mean that he wants to ridicule or destroy Odysseus or the traits that he has. But it is a trend in tragedy to put emphasis on the limits of humans, of heroes. And things change in 5th century tragedy. So maybe he just wants to emphasize the limits that a human being has, no matter how clever or bold that person is. But yeah, you make a point, you make a good point.
Thank you.
Maria Eugenia.
Yes, thank you. So maybe Aeschylus is reshaping the chaos itself and putting into at stake this value chaos by marking the limits of man, and questioning that the value of chaos itself, or the glory of the heroes.
Yeah, that's probable. Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ian.
Thank you. Do we have any idea when this trilogy was presented, and if there might be any contemporary events that Aeschylus was commenting on, a failed nautical expedition? Who knows?
Yeah, that is actually a $1 million question, but we do not know. And we assume that maybe it was presented before the Iliadic trilogy, but that is all we have. We do not know anything more specific. But that would help a lot if we knew. We could understand it much better.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
I was interested in how his experiences at the hands of the suitors were even more humiliating than they are in what we have in the Odyssey. I think he does get hit once in the Odyssey with a stool.
Yeah, by Antinous.
But then after that, they keep missing. And some people, I think, have argued that his experiences in the guise of a beggar are mock heroic because they're not on a battlefield. But then you mentioned the quality of his endurance. Do you see that as the heroic part of his Odyssean experience as opposed to what Aeschylus presents?
Well, all I do is compare these two episodes. I mean, in the Odyssey, he endures humiliation, of course, but most of the times he is relatively safe and protected. He doesn't really get hurt. I mean, Antinous hit him once with a stool, yeah, and then everyone else is angry at Antinous, and Penelope curses Antinous. So it is not that bad. But here in the Astrology, it is very degrading to hear that the chamber pot was broken over his head. That is not something that a king should have to endure. I don't know if I answered your question. I'm sorry. Okay, thank you.
Did you say, Zoe, that the fragments are all related by somebody else? They're quoted by somebody else, the ones that we have.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if that affects the way that any of this is presented. You know, if someone is trying to make Odysseus look worse or better, or if someone could be trying to make Aeschylus look worse or better by quoting or misquoting. What do we know about who quoted these fragments and the relationship of that person to Aeschylus?
Well, these fragments from the astrology actually come from Athenaeus, who thinks that it is wrong of Aeschylus to present such scenes because they show that Greek people get drunk and misbehave. So I don't know if he wanted to present Odysseus in a different way, but he accuses Aeschylus of showing that Greek people can't handle their drink and then they behave in a way that is completely inappropriate. Mm-hmm. We do have a papyrical fragment for the soul raisers, and it is difficult to read it because it was written by a student who was trying to learn to write Greek. So he made so many mistakes that we struggled, not me, but others before me struggled to find out what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, too.
So does that explain the absence of the gods in the piece? I mean, you theorized the god, some god appears to help settle down the suitors, dead suitors and their families, but there might have been more presence of the gods in the piece, but the person who presents the fragments didn't choose to show that part. Is that possible?
Yeah, I don't know. There is a mention of Persephone in the Soul Raisers, but it is in one-word fragment, and that's why I didn't present it. Now, we have such little information, so maybe the gods were not absent. Maybe they're just absent from the fragments that survived. I don't know.
Makes sense, though. Thank you.
Thank you.
It strikes me hearing, excuse me, about these fragments that I can think of 3 times where in Aeschylus, people are getting, I think, instructions about how to communicate with the dead. Here in the libation bearers, and I think in the Persians as well, at least. Is that unique to Aeschylus? Is he known to be particularly interested in necromancy or something?
Yeah, I don't know, because there are many similarities between the scene in the Persians and the scene in the Psychology. And the gods that are being invoked, and the libations that he has to offer, the sacrificed animals. There are many similarities, but I didn't talk a lot about that because it is not related to the reception of the epic tradition that much. But it is interesting. It is an interesting topic.
Gogo, I see you have your hand up again. Go ahead.
Yes. So is this type of ritual something that is practiced in contemporary would the audience be familiar with this ritual? Would they have experienced it themselves of calling up the dead by this procedure, or is this something from antiquity?
Well, to be honest, I do not know. But if they had watched the Persians, they would be familiar with it.
Well, any other questions? I guess we're probably about at our hour. So I'd like to wrap things up. But yeah, Ian, you can have the last word.
I just wondered, are there no fragments from the Circe Satyr play? Or any information about more information about it?
No, there are 2 one-word fragments, and that's all. We didn't get lucky with this tetralogy.
All right. Well, Zoe, thank you so much. This was really interesting.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Keith.
Mm-hmm.